Well done, John.
I call Honi Harawira.
Good speech, mate.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. Kia ora tātou katoa te whare. Mr. Speaker, the Appropriation Bill includes within its schedules, the commitment and departmental output expenses to implement the government's decisions on the Royal Commission on Auckland Governance. Pretty straightforward, you might think, until you get to the report of the Local Government and Environment Committee, and then it starts to come unstuck. Yes, there were issues about cost, but the real issue for us as a Māori party and for the whole nation was the arrogant dismissal of the issue of Māori representation. Mr. Speaker, this House knows well of our commitment to strong Māori representation at every level of governance in this country because of the value we placed on the treaty partnership and the honouring of that partnership by both Māori and the Crown. In fact, our agreement with the National Party includes a line which reads, both the National Party and the Māori Party will act in accordance with Te Treaty o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. And we take that line seriously because the treaty partnership is the basis of the Crown's relationship with Māori, and we expect government to do its best to uphold the treaty. And the issue of the Māori seats was just the vehicle for the Prime Minister to use to advance his philosophy about taking the country forward. And he would have had the support. Heck, even before he came along, the Royal Commission on the Reorganisation of Auckland travelled all over the region, talked to hundreds of people, received more than 3,500 submissions, and publicly recommended Māori seats, making the point that Māori have simply not been represented in local governance at all. 8 councillors in 150 years is an indictment on the current system, not an endorsement. On election night 2008, the Prime Minister famously spoke of looking forward to a positive relationship with the Māori Party. The Māori seats in Parliament have been there for more than 100 years without there ever being a collapse of government. And with the emergence of the Māori Party, finally a recognition that the Māori seats in the House provide the opportunity for greater participation by Māori in the electoral process and more independent thinking from Māori MPs. The newly minted Minister of Local Government thought he could run a slow one past the Māoris in Auckland by talking up the importance of the Auckland Governance Select Committee process, probably expecting people to oppose the Māori seats there. But what do you know? The Select Committee also travelled all over the region, talked to hundreds of people, received more than 2,500 submissions, and guess what? More than 80% of non-Māori submissions also came out in support of the Māori seats. More than 80%, 100% of the Māori submissions, but that's to be expected. Most of the councils in Auckland have come out in support of the Māori seats as well, as have 3 of Auckland's mayors. The Prime Minister himself thought the seats was a deal worth doing. The Leader of the Opposition supported it. Russell Norman and Metiria Ture added their weight as leaders of the Greens. And of course the Māori parties, Tariana Turia and Peter Sharples, were clearly in favour of the Māori seats as well. Thousands of Aucklanders marched in support of the Māori seats. And for heaven's sake, even the good old conservative New Zealand Herald spoke out strongly in favour of those Māori seats. And yet what do we get from the Minister of Local Government? A threat to throw his toys out of the cot if he can't get his way. A threat to resign if the Māori seats goes in as part of his legislation. Well, so much for democracy. In fact, government caved in completely by announcing their rejection of the Māori seats even before the Select Committee report was in. Never mind the hundreds of thousands of dollars wasted on the exercise, never mind about the will of the people, never mind even thinking about the overwhelming support for the Māori seats from all over the place and from all kinds of people, black, white and all shades in between. And the Select Committee, wow, what a bloody joke that turned out to be, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad that I didn't bother hauling my little black ass all around all the hearings, because at the end of the day, the word was sent down from on high. We don't care what you National and ACT members of the Select Committee saw. We don't care who you met. And we certainly don't care what you heard. You will put together a mealy-mouthed report that uses petty little words like substantial instead of overwhelming, and prattles on about different models as the reason for trying to deny what people were actually saying.
Point of order, David Garrett.
Mr Speaker, I've listened very carefully to this speech and I haven't heard one reference at all to expenditure on anything thus far.
Probably prior to the member coming in, please sit down. To the member coming in, there is an amendment in the name of the opposition that talks about the Maori seats in Auckland, and this member is actually speaking to the amendment in the name of the opposition, so it is in order. The Honourable, Honi Harawira.
We don't care what you National Act members of the Select Committee saw. We don't care who you met, and we certainly don't care what you heard. You will put together a mealy-mouthed report.
Order. The member cannot bring me into the debate. You've mentioned you many times. Just concentrate, please, on the substantive nature of your speech without bringing the Speaker into it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. That uses petty little words like substantial instead of overwhelming, and prattles on about different models as the reason for trying to deny what people were actually saying. And 80% of those submissions can be summed up in 5 little words. We support the Māori seats. Ngāti Whātua's chairperson, Nader Glavish, described the government's unequivocal no to Māori representation as a slap in the face. She said the future now looked bland and unrepresentative. Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei spokesman Ngāri Muble described it as just one more chapter in our long struggle. A struggle to uphold the nation's constitutional foundations. A struggle to live by the promise of the Treaty of Waitangi. Tainui Chairman Tukuroirangi Morgan said that he was disappointed in Mr Key, saying he had caved into Rodney and his 1% party. Mr Morgan went on to say that he thought the relationship with Māori was a significant relationship. Well, clearly, said Mr Morgan, that has amounted to nothing. Mr Morgan said that Tainui would refuse to take part in any advisory board, and I quote, "That's not where the decisions are made. Giving Māori people the crumbs at the second level is a nonsense." Right. And we've made it quite clear we are not interested in being a teko teko or a tono tono. Right. People who are subservient to the top table. Mehi atu ki aia. Mr Speaker, I wanted to present those views up front because this House needs to understand how seriously Māori view this breach of the relationship between Māori and the Crown. Hugely, massively disappointing, but surprisingly unsurprising. Mr Speaker, I put all this before the House today as we consider the Appropriations Bill because it also signals the substantial cost that this nation can ill afford. Mr Speaker, in the same way that this country agonised over MMP and finally accepted it as a model which would better enhance democratic representation in the Parliament of this nation, so too should we be bold enough to consider other ways of enhancing representation at local body level. And in the same way that Māori seats in Parliament is a means of enhancing democratic representation for a treaty partner in a plural society, so too are Māori seats on the proposed Auckland Council. Mr Speaker, the facts tell us that Māori representation does not happen as of right, and that it will not happen unless there is the political will for the treaty to matter. When government says that if the new Auckland Council wants Māori seats, then they can choose to establish them, then they are consigning those Māori seats to the dustbin of history. For if there are no Māori seats in the council to begin with, who on earth is going to advocate for them to be established? The long history of Māori participation and representation in local government is all the evidence we need to support the view that this House has an obligation to provide for Māori representation in the governance structure of the proposed Auckland Council. Peter Sharple said that Māori will never go away and that Māori representation is inevitable. All that Rodney Hyde's political tactics are doing is putting off the inevitable, putting this government on the wrong side of history and bringing discord to the relationship between Māori and the Crown. The Māori Party will continue to work with mana whenua with other Māori in Auckland to fight this attack on our rights as treaty partners and to push for those Māori seats. And let me make one final statement about those seats, if I may. Getting Māori seats at local government is like having Pantene shampoo. It may not happen overnight, but it will happen. The sadness is that when history looks back at this time, it won't see a head of shining hair. All it will see is a balding scalp full of kutus because Rodney won't share his shampoo. Kia ora tātou.